Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video and to another interview, second day in a row. And not only that, the second day in a row that I've cocked up the timing and forgotten to change the time on the YouTube video after rescheduling the interview. So I so apologize that there's been people probably sat there for an hour going, does he exist anymore? I do exist. I am here, and I'm really happy to introduce you to, or you may already know him well. Most probably, it's Adam Lee, who has been fairly prolific in writing in terms of blogging over the years, and has written. Well, he's known for Daylight Atheism, the blog, and also a book by the same name. And our paths have never really crossed, which is quite interesting because we live in the same kind of ecosystem. But we are now colleagues on the new platform of OnlySky. So I will introduce you to Adam Lee. Adam, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I agree. Our paths have never quite crossed before now. So it's good to finally do this getting to know you thing. Hopefully we can do this with some of our other OnlySky colleagues too.
Yeah, because I get a feeling there's an awful lot. It's such a vast array of interesting names and voices, and I know of them, but have never really sort of crossed paths, and so it is quite an exciting time. I have quoted articles of yours before when I've done blog pieces of my own. In fact, I think I wrote on the Tower of Babel only a couple of weeks ago, and quoted, I think, a piece that you had done previously on that. So, but would you like to introduce yourself and what you're doing at the moment and where you're at?
Sure. Yes. So my name is Adam Lee. I live in New York City. I am an atheist blogger and author full time now. This is now my sole career, and hopefully we're going to be able to make that work. And
Wow.
I guess I feel like I don't have a very interesting personal story. I don't think I have a dramatic deconversion to relate like many of our colleagues. I think I was brought up in a non-religious family, and I always considered myself just vaguely deist, I suppose, in a general sense until college. And I think the first serious interactions I had with hardcore fundamentalist religious people that I knew, like people who actually believed the Bible or the Quran, took it very literally, was enough to kind of give me a shock into reevaluating what it was that I believed and why. And I realized I never really had a good reason for being a deist. I think it was just something I absorbed from the culture around me. And I decided, when I came across some atheist writings on the internet while researching what it was I believed, I felt that they spoke to me very profoundly. And I thought, I think this is what I have been all along. I just never knew it. And I never looked back. And I felt that I wanted to start a website, at least explaining my rationale for why I came to the position I did. And that was my first website, which later evolved into Daylight Atheism. That was an independent blog for a few years. It was picked up by a New York media company called Big Think. And then in 2013, moved to Pathos, and we know the rest of the story.
Yeah. And yeah, that the always good when so that's what Adam looks and sounds like. It's always interesting when you follow people in written form and then you never sort of come across them. It's like you have these preconceptions, like, oh my god, you look totally different to how I thought. But there you go.
Yeah, I probably could use a haircut. Honestly, I blame Omicron. We have not left our house for too much for the past couple of weeks.
Well, we've just pretty much, my whole family's just got Omicron. It came and went with us without really, my partner was a little bit ill, but generally we're all boosted up, and so it's all pretty good. So now you've moved from Pathos non-religious to OnlySky, and in fact, I'll just show the viewers a bit of your stuff here. So here we have Adam Lee under the moniker of Daylight Atheism. We have become columnists there, but rather than sort of bloggers. So, I wonder how long we'll keep the Atypical Philosopher and Daylight Atheism sort of names and whatnot. But you've already written some pieces. What would you say interests you most in what you write about at the moment? And have you changed over time?
Yeah, I think when I started out blogging, I was more interested in sort of these pure atheist arguments about why not to believe in God, the problem of evil, things of that nature. And it's kind of come to the point where that no longer interests me as much as it used to. Having debates with Christian apologists doesn't really interest me as much as it used to. I think now my time is better spent talking about, we agree that we're atheists. So let's talk now about how to live a better life and what sort of implications flow from a non-theistic humanist moral philosophy. I just find that more interesting nowadays because I feel like debating religious apologists is really just rehashing the same half dozen arguments over and over.
So it's not really about what we're not, it's about what we are.
Yeah, and I think debating is a poor way to change people's minds in any case. I think a better way is to make an atheist philosophy, an atheist worldview look appealing, look fulfilling.
Well, because in some sense, when you are presenting a state of being, a worldview to someone who believes something, you need to entice them, and you need to replace what they I mean, I keep talking about this, but you need to replace what they have with something that's better, hopefully. Right. I suppose the challenge is for things like the afterlife, when we the best we can do is like, oh yeah, you die and that's it.
It's a bitter pill to swallow. But I also do think that belief in the afterlife is very much a double-edged sword, because if you believe in an eternal afterlife of bliss, then certainly that makes death less scary, but it also makes life less urgent. I feel like it diminishes the importance of doing the best you can with your time here on Earth. To be honest, we see this a lot with the COVID wave going around now. I don't know if you have this problem in the UK quite as much as we do in the US, but there are definitely a lot of evangelical Christians here who refuse the vaccine, in part because they figure, well, if I get it and I die, then I just go to heaven. And what's so bad about that?
This is sort of like, welcome in the end times. That people say, hey, we don't need to look after the world. We can drive around in these cars belching whatever on purpose in order to bring about the end times, because there's nothing wrong with the end times, because, hey, the rapture and whatever your belief system is. I mean, yeah. What would you say is the best antidote to, or the best argument or rationale you can give to someone who is convinced and wants there to be an afterlife of heaven?
I would honestly say if it really gives you comfort to believe that, I would not necessarily try to talk them out of that. I find that trying to get people to give up religious beliefs that appeal to them on a powerful, on an emotional level, is usually futile. And I would say if you really believe in heaven, if it gives you comfort, that's fine, but don't give up this life, which is the only one we know for sure we have, for an uncertainty. Just make the most of your time now. And if it turns out there is an afterlife, like a heavenly afterlife, then I guess we'll all be very pleasantly surprised here. And if there isn't, then at least you can ensure that your time on Earth was not wasted.
Yeah, I mean, my general belief these days is if someone holds, it doesn't really matter what belief someone holds. I think I've chilled out a little bit, where it doesn't matter what belief you hold, as long as it doesn't morally impact upon me and the people in society in a negative way. It's that kind of consequentialism, I suppose. That kind of like, yeah, you can believe what you like as long as it's kind of inoffensive.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think most of us go through an angry atheist phase, and with time we grow out of it more or less. And I agree with that. Whatever beliefs you want to believe, if you're not hurting anyone because of them, then it's no concern of mine. Of course, the problem is there are many people who do use the beliefs they hold as a justification to cause harm.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and talking about saying that we've got over this, let's go back a little bit to your earlier days, maybe of blogging and your book, Daylight Atheism. Well, first of all, what initially got you into writing? I mean, was it just feeling really strongly about atheism?
Yeah, I think I've always had that dream of being a writer. It's just always seemed very naturally appealing to me. And when I became an atheist, I thought, well, this is a very controversial position, and people may be shocked. So maybe I should tell the world about why I came to hold this idea. And it just snowballed from there. Eventually, once I found out there was a whole secular community of people who believe the same things, and a lot of these people, they seemed like really cool people. I thought, well, maybe we can reach out. I can meet them through my writing. We'll be friends, and it seemed to work out that way. So I just started writing. I never stopped.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was speaking to a psychologist yesterday and talking about how when people come to new worldviews, they often become really evangelical and really kind of like, well, I believe this, so therefore you should believe this. And you know, that was, and it doesn't matter, you know, whether it be anything political, religious, but particularly religious, because sometimes we talked about how atheists, if they've been inculcated, and you're quite different here because maybe you didn't have that upbringing, but some atheists who have been in a religious framework, a very strong one for a long time, then come out of that and they're very bitter and they're very angry that they've wasted a lot of their lives, and so therefore they become really evangelical about their atheism. Were you evangelical at all when you first kind of, you know,
Oh yeah, definitely. You know, and I think we all go through this. Not all of us are teenagers, but this adolescent phase of, I found this really great idea. I just need to explain it very clearly, and everyone will agree with me. What could be simpler than that? And we were all disappointed by reality on that score.
It's funny. Yeah. I was going to say, my dad, when he gets like a printer and he really likes a printer, he'll then go and say, "Oh, I've bought you this printer." It's like, I don't need a printer. You spend a load of money. Yeah, but I've got it and it's brilliant. It's like, yeah, okay. Don't project yourself onto me.
And I think every new idea, new philosophy, even new hobby just is most interesting to you when you're first learning about it, and you naturally assume that everyone else wants to hear about it too. And I also wonder, maybe not in my case because I didn't have a religious upbringing, but I wonder if there are some people, like you said, who are not just angry about the time they wasted or the untruths they believed, but also perhaps some people whose natural tendency is just to go to the most extreme end of whatever philosophy they adopt. So people who start out as very committed, very devoted believers become very passionate atheists.
Yeah, and I suppose if you're also like into like witnessing, if you're into like trying to convince other people to your worldview, and then your worldview does a 180 shift, then you're still like trying to convince people.
Right.
So either way. So when you started getting into the arguments about atheism, what did you think was the strongest argument for you against the existence of God?
The strongest argument. Oh, that's a good one. Well, I could be obvious and say the problem of evil, because I do still think that is a very potent one. I think most people, if given omnipotent power, could come up with a better world than the one we live in. But I think, honestly, for me, the one that is the most interesting, the one that really drew me in early on, was learning about scientific evidence for the brain and how it produces the mind. And it makes it very obvious that the traditional religious view of consciousness is coming from an immortal soul that inhabits the body just cannot possibly be true, because brain damage and mental illness can cause all kinds of extremely unusual and specific alterations of identity and personality in a way that's basically impossible to explain if your consciousness resides in your soul. Things like certain kinds of brain damage can cause people to change their religious beliefs, can cause their personality to do a complete 180-degree shift. You probably know the story of Phineas Gage, that famous miner who suffered a frontal lobe injury that his friends and family said he was the complete opposite kind of person he used to be afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, he started the whole ball rolling with research and understanding, you know, of research into and understanding of sort of mind brain supervenience, like the dependence of the mind on the brain, and how your personality can shift by altering brain states. I mean, the problem is with the soul, arguments about the soul, is no one is really. I've written chapters on the soul before. No one really knows or can express, exactly what the soul is and exactly what the soul does. And different Christians will say different things. Like, at the very least, it's a vehicle that gets you to transcend this material life to get you into heaven and hell, right? So that you're represented, you are you there and here. But when you ask, well, okay, a little bit more detail, then they start saying, well, it's rationality. I was like, no, that's rationality's in your brain. That's we can understand rationality. Okay, then it's consciousness. Well, then no, that's just consciousness. Okay, no, it's this. No, it's that. No, well, that's this and that's that. So what is it? Because all the things you're saying it is, we already can explain with our naturalistic understanding of the world.
Yeah, and almost every emotion or personality trait can be linked to a specific region in the brain, or the presence or absence of a specific neurotransmitter. You know, so one thing we recently found out is that exposure to lead as a child makes people more impulsive and aggressive as adults. It makes them more violent, less able to control their impulses. On the other hand, things like towns that have higher natural levels of lithium in their drinking water have lower rates of depression. Right? This analogy I've used is that our bodies, our minds are just this Democritean dance of atoms entering and then departing a pattern. And you change the atoms that make up the pattern, you change the person.
But then would the Christian then come back, or the theist in general, would they come back and say, hey, we can't understand consciousness. No one really understands it. Therefore, God, surely God is the best explanation of consciousness.
Well, they always, the God of the gaps always works. And I think there's so much we still have to learn about consciousness. But if it's true, as Christian theology claims it is, that God will judge you for your actions taken while on earth, then it's very hard for them to explain that certain changes to the material makeup of your brain can cause you to commit actions that you have no real conscious control over.
Really good point. And of course, that gets you onto the whole free will debate, which to me is a killer of the judgmental God. I mean, I always say that, when people say, oh, what would you debate? If you were to debate William Lane Craig, what would you argue? And I always say, well, do you know what? The first thing I say is you need to prove how free will works. Because if you don't do that, your judgmental God makes absolutely no sense. And unless you can do that, and here's a little problem for you, no philosopher's done that in the history of the world adequately, then you've got a problem. But that's a whole other debate.
I think free will was something I struggled with a bit. I think Daniel Dennett wrote some books on free will that kind of helped me come to terms with it. That free will doesn't mean the ability to act without prior cause, because what could that possibly be? That would just mean your actions, your choices are completely random. The only thing free will could possibly mean is your ability to choose in accordance with your circumstances. And that means that people can certainly have more or less free will according to their upbringing, according to how much their education, how much choice their environment gives them.
Yeah, so that's the classic sort of compatibilist approach, which is like I free will and causal determinism are both compatible with each other. But basically what you're doing is redefining free will. It's not being able to do what you want it is being able to do what you want, but what you want is itself determined, because you are who you are in the situation you're in. And I like Dennett's approach with regard to the fact that he admits that, without causal determinism, free will doesn't make any sense. Like you say, it's just random. You need determinism to make sense of your actions and behavior.
Yeah, and I think, atheist or theist, you really can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps on this, because free will is the ability to choose in accordance with your desires. But where do your desires come from? You can't pick desires for yourself, because if you didn't have any desires to start with, what would be the basis for that? Everyone has to start with some kind of inborn nature or, personality that they don't choose for themselves. And then I think the best we can hope for is to be able to modify ourselves in beneficial ways.
Yeah, so this is what Arthur Schopenhauer said: man can do what he wills, but he can't will what he wills.
Right.
Which is that kind of thing. It's like, that level of. So what when you mentioned the problem of evil earlier, and I know chapter 3 in your book Daylight Atheism is about that. It's what's it called? All Possible Worlds, I think.
Right.
What are your views on the problem of evil? Because you recognize that it's a major thorn in the side of Christians or theists, and I would completely agree. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the most obvious proof of the problem of evil is that Christians are constantly praying for God to change his plan and to fix these bad things that exist in the world, praying for healing, praying for relief from disasters, praying for protection. Like, what is this if not an admission that the world you believe God created is not satisfactory? And
That's brilliant.
I've
never thought. No, sorry, I'm interrupting you. I've never thought I thought a hell of a lot about this, but the idea that praying because things are so crap is a tacit admission that things are crap and it's unfair. Yeah. But then it's like, oh, but God knows more than me. But carry on.
Yeah, God knows more than me, but please let me pray for him to change his plan anyway. But the other thing I think is, if you could say to a Christian, like, if you had omnipotent power, would you make this world any different than it is now? And I think almost all of us could imagine ways in which the world could be improved. And, not just simple things like we could have fewer natural disasters, but I think people could be made in better ways to reduce the amount of evil in the world, if you believe that there is a God who's capable of that. I think, this paradox that I think Christians and most theists can't really address well is that they believe God created us with strong inherent urges to do things he doesn't want us to do.
Yeah.
And then punishes us for acting on them.
Yeah, I've done so many videos and writing on exactly what you're talking about. I like, yeah, this stuff really excites the hell out of me. But you know, and just simple things like why don't we photosynthesize? Why don't all like meat-eating animals photosynthesize, and then you wouldn't need to get your energy from literally killing other living
Yeah, that'd be
creatures.
cool.
So, yeah, going back the other way though. So the problem of evil is, I think, a problem because it's really evocative and emotive as an argument. So it really plays on people's emotions because pain and suffering is tangible and you recognize it all around you. So that's why I think that's really, really a good argument. But what about the best argument for theism? Well, I mean, is there any that you have ever struggled with?
I always think the cosmological argument is an interesting one because although I don't agree with the conclusion they lead to, it's not obviously wrong like many of the arguments they use are like the argument from design, for example. We can just easily dismiss this as wrong. We understand the natural forces that produce complexity. But the question of why is there a universe? Why is there something rather than anything? No, I think that's probably the deepest philosophical question there is. And I don't think anyone has a satisfactory answer to it. And maybe there cannot be a satisfactory answer to it because any answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing presupposes a something which has causal powers. I think that's going to be a mystery for all of us. And while I don't agree with the theist explanation, it's not one that could just be discounted out of hand as erroneous.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, and again, I've thought a lot about. It's funny you say that because that is the only question that makes me go, "Oh, it doesn't get me anywhere near like theism or anything," because I think it's exactly the same problem for a theist as it is for the atheist. But it's just one of those head scratches where maybe the question's a bit wrong. Maybe there is no answer, like you say. I mean, there are lots of ways that you can approach this. But for the theist, it's just as much a problem, which is, okay, well, why is there God rather than not God?
Right.
You know, and then there's, oh, God is necessary. Yeah, but really, is that philosophically viable?
Saying that something is necessary and therefore must exist, it just seems to me like a trick of language, not really a way of reasoning about the real world.
Yeah, I'd agree. And then you could argue that we're just as necessary anyway, because if God is necessary and created us, that we, even as contingent creation, came out of God's necessary characteristics, and he had no chance to deliberate because time didn't exist. So it's just like an instance of like existing and then us existing.
Right.
Or this universe existing, then we appear to be pretty much just as necessary as God is anyway. So I don't know. You might as well just. I think it's simpler to say the universe is necessary. Get over it. But there you go. But so you'd say the cosmological arguments, which is maybe slightly different.
I would call it an intriguing argument.
Yeah, fair enough. And are there any other like theistic things that you've heard that have been challenging for you? I mean, you know, has anyone challenged you particularly in
no, I think another thing that atheists do need to think about, at the very least, is why it is that belief in a god or gods seems to be such a universal or nearly universal aspect across human cultures, which doesn't necessarily make that belief true. I mean, after all, many cultures believe in different incompatible gods, but belief in supernatural entities is so widespread, it does seem to be something that, you know, in some sense is built into our psychological makeup. And I think atheists should give careful consideration to the question of why that is. I mean, obviously, the fact that we're having this conversation, you and me, proves that supernatural belief is not universal. But it does seem to be very common, like a very appealing hypothesis to human minds.
Do you think it's more appealing to less developed human minds? No, not less developed minds, less developed human culture, minds of less developed human cultures. So in other words, is it definitely more susceptible to people 2,000 years ago as now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I certainly think the rate of non-belief accelerating over the past few decades is proof that it's not an immovable belief. I certainly do think that it's more common in, I don't want to say more primitive cultures in a way that implies a value judgment I don't want to make.
Yeah,
but
I get that.
I wrote a post for OnlySky recently about this, about how I think supernatural religion was sort of our first fumbling attempt at science. It was our first attempt at distilling the complexity of the world into something that we could understand and potentially influence. To ancient people who didn't know anything about genes or climatology or any of the things we take for granted, the question of, why do the crops grow, was both a deeply mysterious and urgently practical question. And it seems like perhaps a natural hypothesis that perhaps there is some entity that is in charge of crop growth, and perhaps if we appease that entity, they will bless us with a good harvest. An interesting idea that I came across recently is that a lot of people picture religion as it begins with the doctrine and then it trickles down to the beliefs. Like someone said that the gods are angry and here's what we have to do to appease them. But it seems very possible that in reality it happened the reverse way, that the rituals came first as almost this like blind Pavlovian trial and error attempt to influence the world in our favor. And then when a ritual seemed to produce the desired effect, we then went on to infer the existence of a supernatural entity that this ritual targets or appeals to. Like there's an interesting verse in the Bible where the brothers Cain and Abel both try to bring sacrifices before God, and one brings, I always forget which is which. One brings a sacrifice of plants from the field, and one brings a sacrifice of meat from an animal. And Yahweh prefers the sacrificial animal. And it's possible that this passage represents the dim memory of a real historical event, that perhaps, the farmers and the herdsmen were competing over who had the true understanding of God. And the herdsmen said, well, our sacrificial ritual worked better than yours. So clearly our God is the real one, and our God is the one who prefers blood sacrifice to peaceful plant sacrifice. And I think that would explain a lot of the Old Testament.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking about this the other night with Ed Dodge, talking about how, in fact, exactly like you say, there's theories that the proto-Israelites, which probably Canaanites, were living in the hills, in the hill areas, and therefore, as shepherds, they were comparing themselves, as you do, and making yourself superior to the farmers, the arable farmers, and this is kind of a story, sort of a legendary mythological story that kind of explains that in some sense. So yeah, that's really interesting. So I've forgotten where we were. That's my MS brain going a little mental. Because I had a really important question. What were you just saying
about the farmers and the herdsmen and ritual preceding belief in terms of sacrifice?
Yeah, no, I've forgotten. Totally forgotten.
We'll come back to it.
Oh yeah, no, that was it. So as you say, it appears that as we go through history, we are becoming less and less religious, and as we go through history, we are understanding more and more about the world around us. Therefore, it does look like there's at least a correlation and probably a causation between understanding more and believing less. Would you say that's a fair thing to? Would you say the role of religion has been historically to explain that which we don't understand yet?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think you can see that trend of science displacing supernatural explanations over time, never the reverse. Because the more we learn about how the world works, and the more we learn that it truly is this sort of blind Democritean machine of atoms moving in accordance with physical law, the more the supernatural explanations kind of get squeezed out, because they just don't add anything to the explanations that have been shown to work. And so, most people, I guess, by Occam's razor, maybe like an unconscious application of Occam's razor, start to discard them. Like the people who we believe in faith healing when it was all that we could do, but now when most religious people get sick, they go to the hospital and they pray that the doctors and nurses will be able to successfully cure whatever's ailing them. So you can see how the natural explanation just slowly grows over time, and the supernatural explanation just keeps getting smaller and pushed to the fringes.
You're absolutely right. And then the frustration when after like 13 hours of surgery and 8 like professionals working really hard using like thousands of hours of training, and they go, "Oh, thank God that my husband's, God has granted a miracle." And you're like, "No, it's not. That's science. That's science working."
And when they thank God for their loved one pulling through, but they don't thank the doctors and nurses who actually did the work, that really angers me every time.
And as you're saying, these things, the explanatory power of God gets pushed further and further out until it's really, and we're gonna go back to the two things we've already talked about, which is consciousness and the universe. Yep. And so basically, that is realistically and you could argue abiogenesis, Like, I mean, I'd say, well, for all of these, I would say naturalism is by far the better explanation. And I would use some inductive reasoning, which is that if supernaturalism, I think you were hinting at this, supernaturalism has replaced naturalism as an explanation 10,000 times in a row over history. Naturalism has replaced supernaturalism, but supernaturalism has never replaced naturalism. So therefore, which horse are you going to bet on?
Right. And I think, something else I've written about is that this idea of the Greek atomist philosophers, that the universe was made, the word atom means uncuttable in Greek, that the universe was made at core of these tiny microscopic uncuttable particles coming together to combine in various patterns to form nature. This was an idea that the church considered deeply heretical, even demonic, for a very, very long time. And the idea that we actually do live in this world of atoms moving in accordance with natural law is something that ancient churchmen would have been horrified and shocked by.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just say thank you to Mitch? Mitch, great supporter, great guest, enjoying the dialogue. Thanks. It's really kind of you. And thanks for these super chats. And this is going to be a slightly shorter interviews, probably going to about an hour. So please do get your super chats in. If you have anything to ask Adam or myself, or, we'll both give it a shot. And if we don't know, do you know what? It's all right to say we don't know. We're not just going to go, oh, God did it. But there you go. No, thank you, Mitch. It's really, really kind. So you were talking about how... well, you mentioned how you've written an article. I'm going to share again, just to show what was this what you were talking about? Science lets us tell better stories.
Yeah, that's the one.
So do you just want to explain that a little bit more?
Sure. And the idea I had that kind of was the genesis of this article is it is astonishing to me that we know what wild plants are good to eat, because so many of them will make you, mushrooms, a lot of things in nature will either make you sick or kill you. But we know well before the scientific revolution, we knew which ones were good to eat and which ones were poisonous. And I was just contemplating the number of people who must have sickened and killed themselves over thousands of years to figure this out. But try a little nibble, see if you die, and if you don't, then come back the next day. And the point of this was that ancient people had a huge amount of deeply practical knowledge about how to survive in the world we live in. But what they didn't have was an understanding of the deeper root causes behind why that knowledge worked, why one thing worked and another didn't. And religion was, like I said, was probably the first attempt at science that was invented to fill the gap using myths and magical formulas and rituals to try to come up with like a why for the how that they already knew. And the superiority of science is that it gives us the true explanation that our ancestors didn't really understand. Like, they knew about crop exhaustion, but not why it happened. And now we know about things like salt accumulation in the soil and organic fertilizer. So the knowledge, they knew how to survive, but they didn't know why that knowledge worked. And now we do. And with that knowledge, we can actually tell better stories than the religious stories, which were concocted to explain that in our ignorance. Now we can tell true stories that explain the real root causes of nature. And hopefully we don't have to stick to reiterating, the old religious myths that prevailed for millennia. We can come up with better ones.
This reminds me what you were saying about elders eating, or not necessarily elders, people eating sort of berries that might be poisonous and then dying. And then this is a form of like testing. Basically, this is your data that you're collecting over time. Communities would collect data on the flora and fauna around them, saying, "Don't go there. If you go there, you're more likely to be eaten by a lion. Don't eat those berries because those ones are bad, but these ones are good." And so, I think what this helps to develop is trust in your elders. So this is a kind of a evolutionary adaptive trait where you would say, we listen to our elders because actually that's a shortcut for me. I don't have to eat that berry and see if it's going to make me ill and kill me, because if I trust my elders, literally I will survive. Therefore, there is evolutionary benefit, there's survival benefit for me to trust my elders. But then, just like a moth uses light to navigate, but that can be maladaptive and used to fly into a candle and die. Likewise, children believe their elders about berries, but also about, hey, God exists, and if we don't do this, then God's going to get pissed off. and they go, oh yeah, I believe that too. So there's kind of like that double-edged sword.
Yeah, that's a great analogy about the moth. This historian's blog that I believe I quote in the article says that, for these ancient communities, the proof that the ritual worked is that we are still here. Our ancestors have always done it this way, and it's always worked, and we've always survived. We're still here to teach you that. So in the best case, this works almost like a natural selection of ideas, that communities that believe the good ideas survive and ones that believe the bad ideas die out. But just the same way that junk DNA can hitch a ride on a useful gene, that sometimes some bad ideas and myths and misinformation get mixed in with the good ideas, and they get transmitted down too, because maybe they're neutral or at least not harmful enough. And they're sort of like hitching a ride on the useful knowledge.
And because I really do like the idea of memetics. I know that people don't, there's a lot of pushback about the connecting ideas to genes, but I think it's kind of self-evidently true, which is useful ideas maintain, or ideas that hitch, like you say. But I find there's this interesting scenario where those ideas were useful in that context. So believing God in that context was actually quite useful for you. It created an identity for your community, gave you social cohesion, in-group, out-group psychology, and that added to your survivability. But also there was usefulness in some of the practices you did. So you see certain practices that are just, like, for example, not eating pork was probably quite useful at the time that came into being as a kind of religious doctrine, because maybe there was diseased pigs around at the time that was killing people, and then it gets written in. So it's useful at the time, but then becomes not useful in a different context. And I would say that's the case with religion, which is it serves a purpose, but now I don't think I think it no longer serves that purpose. Would that be fair? Would you agree?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I definitely agree with that. You wonder about how many religious rules still exist because, someone 3,000 years ago just happened to do something one way, and then they wrote it down as an example to follow, and we're still doing it. Like, that famous story about the pork roast, about the woman who learns how to make her, her favorite pork roast from her mother. And her mother always says, okay, cut the ends off the roast before you put it in the oven. And she says, why do we do it that way? And her mother says, I don't know. And then she goes and asks her grandmother, and her grandmother says, well, your great-grandmother had a smaller pot, so we had to cut the ends off to fit the pork roast in the pot. And that was just something that her descendants then imitated without knowing the reason for it. I think a lot of religious ideas pass down that way.
That's a really interesting idea. And I'm going to link back to what we were saying about the shepherds versus the arable farmers. And in the Bible, you've got don't mix your linen and your cotton. No, your wool and your cotton.
Yeah, wool and linen, I think.
Wool and linen, sorry. But wool being from sheep and linen being from, arable farming. So there you've got, again, that.
Yeah, it's like the shepherds and the farmers rivalry. That's a really interesting thought. I never thought of it that way.
It was Ed Dodge that was explaining that to me the other night. I was like, yeah, brilliant. I love it. That makes total sense. Whereas otherwise it would be arbitrary.
So many of these rules are maybe just arbitrary cultural delineations, like the same thing with eating pork, stemming back 2,000 years. We said, well, how do we know that we are a different tribe than this other tribe on the next hill? Well, they eat pork and we don't. Yeah. And this thing that was just a complete, or for that matter, circumcision, something that just started out as a completely arbitrary cultural signifier is now treated as if it were like a cosmic law.
I think one of my favorite parts of the Bible is where Moses is having an argument with God, and he's just about to get the chop, and then his wife cuts the end of his son's penis off, and then touches it to his forehead, and God changes his mind. God goes, "Oh, that's a great idea. I've now changed my mind because you've cut the end of your son's penis off." Oh, so it's like, what is going?
Same thing with this idea that what we mentioned earlier, that God gives people drives He doesn't want them to act on. Apparently, God also gave us body parts He wanted us to cut off.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, that's a great point. So going back to OnlySky, I just, because this was, I think, something in your Daylight Atheism book as well that you have talked about, which is there are good things and bad things about religion. We've touched a little bit about this. Is this what these two articles are about? The decline of religion, that's good. The decline of religion, that's bad. What would you say are the positives about religion declining, and then maybe the negatives?
Yeah. Well, I think the positives of religion declining, for atheists like us should go without saying, that it gives science an upper hand in formulating public policy, and evidence-based things like sex education and climate change and reproductive choice and all these good things that are essential to building a thriving society will be more likely to prevail electorally when religion has less influence. So that's definitely a development to be celebrated. But the downside of this, I think, a dynamic that's very visible, at least in the United States, is that as religion shrinks in absolute numbers, it becomes more ideologically aggressive because it's a lot of the more moderate believers who are leaving or being driven out. And the ones that remain are like the hardest of the hardcore fundamentalists, who can then exert more influence within their own denominations in setting the course of that religion's policy. I think evangelicals and white evangelicals in America in particular have nurtured this idea that they are the rightful owners of society, or the people who should be in charge. And all of a sudden they're starting to feel like an outcast minority because they no longer get their way like they're used to. And they're getting very aggressive because they feel that the world is persecuting them, and it's like it's us or them. This is a war on Christianity, and we have to respond. We have to win by any means necessary. So
I wonder if this is a sorry you go.
Yeah, definitely becoming more ideologically aggressive, more politically militant, and in some cases more like dangerous, like even to the extent of terrorism.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And again, I talked about this last night with Caleb Lack, Dr. Caleb Lack, exactly about this. Christian nationalism is about people who have been on the defensive because actually they're losing the battle of ideology. And as they see, their religious colleagues like leaving their religion, and feeling the attack on them, they will fight harder. I wonder if this is a good analogy. Imagine you've got a pot of salt water, and as you boil that salt water, you excite the salt water, you excite the atoms, and a lot of it starts dissolving, and so what you're left with is a really, really very potent salt water, very concentrated, and you're left with the most saltiness of the water molecules. So I wonder if that's what's going on. So what do we do about that then?
I wish I could be more optimistic about this. I think, honestly, the best thing we can hope for is to wait for them to die off, because a lot of that, the ones who are the most aggressive politically and the most conservative are honestly also the oldest. And I think there's a generational turnover happening, especially in the U.S. And I think the UK is even further along in this than we are. Yeah. Every generation is more secular than the last. I'm turning 40 this year. My generation is usually called the millennials, and we were the least religious generation in American history, the most secular. But the one coming up after us, sometimes called Gen Z, is even more secular than us. I've seen polls calling them the least Christian generation in American history. And I think this militancy, this aggressive conservatism among Christian believers is driving young people out of the church. And eventually this process of generational turnover is going to take its toll on them. We kind of just have to hold them off in the meantime, I think.
Interesting. So you think that literally waiting for them to die off, and that because actually what we've done, so we're both writing for OnlySky, and OnlySky, the powers that be, have done loads of demographic analysis about where who our target audience are, and who they aren't, and etc. etc. And the idea is that these younger non-religious people are more apathetic about atheism than we are. And your 40 to 60 year olds. So your 40 to 60 year old atheists are generally like, atheism, and I'll be like arguing about it to toss on the internet every single day. Whereas your 20-year-old at the moment is like, yeah, whatever. Don't really.
Yeah, I mean, because we grew up in a world where the influence of religion on politics was very much an open question. Around my generation, like the debate for marriage equality was a huge inflammatory political controversy in the US for years. And we came of age watching evangelical Christians and Catholics and other denominations say that marriage, should be only for the straights, no gay rights, marriage, women should be subservient, men should be in charge. And we still, we won that battle, but I think that's kind of left its mark on us in seeing religion as an inimical force. Whereas younger generations who grew up only ever knowing marriage equality and LGBTQ rights is more or less a settled. I mean, now there's a new argument over transgender rights, but many of these older controversies they grew up only knowing them as a settled reality. They don't see what the big deal is.
Absolutely. Can I just say thank you to this super chat, Vaguely Agnostic. Again, such a great supporter. And with this 666, always a pleasure, never a chore. Raised secular, explored the church when they told me gay was a choice. It wasn't. Got drunk, got sober. Why is God so concerned with sex habits? I mean, that just short paragraph, that's the whole world of like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I've seen brilliant memes. Sometimes memes are perfect because they just sum up massive bits of theology in really simply. And there's that one of like a Jesus figure, like in space, looking back at the world, and it's like, that person having gay sex has really annoyed me, or something like that. Some like cosmological being, like really caring about, like, honestly,
the omnipotent creator of 100 billion galaxies cares more than anything else about what we do with our genitals.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, particularly, you know, you need to cut the end of them off. But you know, there you go. This is an interesting idea that I will challenge a little bit, and so it's almost like religions were just made up to control people. I think what happens here quite often with things like this, which is they aren't devised to control people, but they end up being manipulated in order that people can be controlled.
They prove to be very useful for that purpose.
Exactly. Yeah. And there was just another thing I was going to bring in. Where was he? This Jerry. So Jerry Penner. My kids in their early 20s don't even know any friends that are believers. When I grew up, everyone was a believer I knew. They are apathetic to religion. True. What was your? I mean, you say you're almost 40, so you would have been born in the early 80s. What was your experience? Did you grow up in New York, though?
Yes.
So that's going to be wildly different from growing up in Bible Belt.
Yeah, and I think the U.S. is definitely almost like more than one country in that regard. You know, the blue states and the blue cities have always had a more liberal, cosmopolitan attitude toward religion, whereas the rural regions, the red states of, you know, and some places in the Midwest, most places in the South, it's a whole different atmosphere. And I always observed that the atheist groups in the South were the biggest and, you know, the most cohesive and the most active, because of course they felt like they had something to unite them. They had an sort of external force pressing them together. Whereas atheist groups in, you know, the Northeast, the West Coast are always kind of more lackadaisical. Because what's the big deal?
Whatever. Hey, I need something to do this weekend, so we'll pop down to this talk and like, no, I can imagine that. Whereas, you know, when you are not the norm, very obviously not the norm, and especially when things like morality is so wrapped up in that, you have to fight to, you know, you're swimming against the current, and you've got to really stick your head above to, you know, show you. I don't know, bring yourself together. I don't know, all these different metaphors, but the idea is, you have to fight for your identity, and I really get that. But yeah, so so where do you think now? I mean, we talked a little bit about. Well, actually, before I go on to that question, I just wanted to say, Alan de Botton, he's a British sort of atheist, right? Atheist philosophical writer or philosopher. He wrote a book, Atheism 2.0, and he's one that always goes around advocating for, you know, taking the best of religion and then putting that onto atheism. So he like go around church and say, these are lovely buildings. I love the music. I love what elements of religion do you think are beneficial and good that you could think atheism could learn from, or atheists, or?
Well, I think, you know, I actually wrote a recent post about this. I've kind of always loved the big churches, the big cathedrals, just to admire the art and the architecture, because even though I don't believe in the beliefs that inspire their construction, they were still intended to be examples of the most magnificent things that human beings could build. And I think they still do achieve that aesthetic effect. I think we do need more, you know, more concern for beauty, more concern for aesthetics, and, you know, just showing what things that are not essential to survival, but things that make life beautiful. I think that is something that atheists could stand to do more of.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Just V57. Always good to have opposing views here. The thing I don't particularly like about atheists is I can't trust you, as you have no foundational beliefs. You believe things like moral anti-realism, potentially condoning anything.
Should I take a shot at this?
Take that, atheist.
And if you want to talk about potentially condoning anything, the surest and quickest way to justify literally any belief or action you want is to say, well, God told me to do it. And that belief has been used to justify every evil in history you can imagine, going back to the genocides of the Hebrew Bible, where supposedly God tells his chosen people, I gave you this land, but someone is already living there. Go and kill them all. So, I mean, I think the moral realism versus anti-realism debate is overblown. I actually believe morality is objective in the sense that there is one correct thing to do in any given circumstance, even if it's very hard to figure out what it is. But I think God is not a helpful ingredient in moral decision making and often has the opposite effect.
Yeah, I think, when it gets to doing a whole big sort of foundation of moral philosophy, it gets really quite technical. And actually, we would need to be here for like a good couple of hours to start bottoming that, or even begin to bottom that one out. I mean, I would say I am a moral anti-realist. So I believe that I don't believe in objective anything, because I think all concepts are naturally conceptual and depend upon the conceiver. So, for example, if all sentient life was to die, there would be no ideas of loyalty, of justice. If there was just rocks in the universe, right, then where would the idea of morality be?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think morality exists because we exist, because there are conscious beings with an appreciation of happiness and suffering. Yeah,
it sounds like you also going along the sort of Sam Harris moral landscape position of like you can find objective. I mean, it all depends on what your axioms are, where you start at, which is maybe the subjective thing, which is like, because even if we say well-being, like humans, it's an objective truth somehow. If you can argue that we all want well-being, then arguing what well-being is and what it looks like is we're going to disagree potentially.
Yeah, that's maybe another conversation.
Yeah,
like you said, it would take hours to unknit that.
Yeah, but it is. I think the problem with comments like this, and I appreciate you for coming on and saying this, but to say that atheists, I can't trust atheists because they believe X is really problematic, because atheists believe all sorts of different things in terms of moral philosophy. In fact, the new Phil Papers 2020 survey has just been published. I know it's 2022, but it's taken a long time to sort of put it all together. So the Phil Papers 2009 survey is the biggest survey of philosophers ever. 2021 is even bigger and has even more answers. And most of the philosophers that have answered that don't believe in God by quite a long margin. And they believe a totally wide array of different things about everything. So to say that atheists believe X is empirically incorrect. And actually, you will get
disagreeing right now.
Yeah,
about realism.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's a bit of a problem. Before we go on to what I was going to say here, ask Adam why God of the Bible is distinctly of male gender.
I always wondered the first time I heard about the Trinity, why was it Father, Son, and Holy Ghost? Why not Father, Son, and Mother? It's like when I was like 6, that seemed like it made way more sense, right? What could God possibly have that makes him male and not female? Does he have a Y chromosome? Does he have a penis? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So what's really funny is I've got 2 children. I've got 11-year-old twin boys, right? And I remember some years ago, one of them said, "Oh, we've been learning about God at school. What do you believe about God?" And I was like, "Right, I don't believe God exists, but I don't want you to believe that, because I don't want to teach you the conclusion. I want to teach you the tools so that you can make up your own mind. And this is really important to me." And then my boy at the time, Oscar, at the age of 8, said, "Yeah, but I want to believe what you believe." And I was like, oh man, this is so interesting. When we're going back to the elders discussion we had earlier, like this is like, whatever you believe, Dad, that's what I want to believe. And I was like, oh man, this is exactly what I don't want to happen.
It's like that, right? It's like evolutionary psychology in action. He just wants to hear from the elders of the tribe what are the, where the good berries grow.
Exactly. And then the other week we were talking about God again, and I said, well, of course, God isn't a he, because God, and I said this in the nicest possible way. God doesn't have a penis. God doesn't have a body. God is an abstract idea, abstract thing. If you believe in God, he doesn't really, these days, people don't believe that God like walks among us and has a body. And they're like, no, God's a man. I'm like, no, but how is God a man? No, God's a man. And they couldn't get over, they couldn't comprehend that God wouldn't be a man. Oh, that's fascinating.
It's very like concrete thinking. And I think I may write about this in OnlySky at some point, because I think the question of what makes a person male or female is unexpectedly complicated when you think about it. Because there are so many different possible answers to this question, but none of them no single trait covers every possible edge case. Especially in nature, you can see gender is more of a continuum, and we've kind of imposed this binary on it, that strict binary categories that most people don't perfectly meet.
Yeah. And we struggle enough with gender and sex in naturalistic in the natural world that we have, and then try and apply those things to an abstract idea is particularly problematic. But I think this speaks towards and again I talked about this recently a lot, the abstraction of God, where God used to walk among us as a in the Hebrew Bible, in those opening books of the Bible. God is definitely, there are elements of God having a body. This is, Francesca Stavrokolopoulos' book. I pronounced that wrongly, but God and Anatomy, God walked among us and had body parts. And then we've abstracted God out of here. But yet there's so much about the Bible that talks about God's, biological sex and gender.
And I think especially in the earlier books of the Hebrew Bible, they had a view probably very similar to the ancient Greeks, that God was just a different kind of being with a different kind of body, but still like a body made of some kind of material. And like you said, we've gradually abstracted away from this over time as it starts to seem more and more ridiculous.
Yeah. The longer we've done philosophy, the more we move away from God being like us. And then, but then I get onto arguments with Christians saying, well, then if God is this abstract idea that's out there, that we're all arguing about what is entailed by that idea, how can you have a loving relationship with that? I mean, what does a loving relationship with God really look like? What does it mean? I mean, can you make any sense of it?
No. And also, for all these Christians who are so agitated about gay rights, well, if God is a male, are you in a same-sex relationship with him?
But I platonically love him. Awesome. Shireen, thank you so much. Is Lowell enjoying the thought that fundamentalist evangelicals are salty? As time goes on, the saltier they are. Yeah, that's true. The older they get, and as time moves on, the saltier they get. Thank you so much for your super chat, Shireen. Really appreciate your support. So thank you very much for that. So as I know you need to get on and whatnot, as the time is very different for you over there. So where do you see yourself going with the kinds of things you're going to be thinking about and therefore writing about?
I think at OnlySky, I want to take a little bit of a step back. I think when I was writing at Pathos, I got into this habit of reacting to whatever the headlines of the day were. And I was kind of getting burned out on that approach by the end. I think OnlySky has been a fresh start, which I really needed, kind of a chance to recharge my creative batteries. And I kind of want to step back more and talk about kind of like the principles of a good worldview, of what it means to live life as an atheist and a humanist, and not necessarily focus so much on reacting to the latest dumb thing some religious person did, because I think those kind of posts are uninteresting and get dated very quickly. I'll still do them occasionally when I'm in the mood, but I think it's more important to build like a corpus of writing that serves as a basis for a good worldview, for a good life. That's my mission.
And I think that's noble, which is here we've got a platform that has the opportunity to change the world, quite literally, like to inform people on what a good life is, but also do the other things, which is calling out political issues and the lack of secularism going on in America, and all these things. But there is a definite need to build up. This is why humanism needs to be sold a lot more than atheism. Atheism, I keep telling Christians this, atheism tells you nothing. It's like going back to what V57 said. It's like, oh, atheists X, Y, and Z. Atheism is like God doesn't exist. Everything else is philosophy. So if you want to say, you therefore have to build everything up from scratch, and then you get to something like humanism. So I think we need to coalesce more around banners like humanism. Would you agree?
And I think proving that God doesn't exist to your satisfaction is the easy part. I think figuring out how to live based on that knowledge is the hard part. I think building up is more difficult and more necessary and more interesting than tearing down.
Yeah, which to finish us off then, before my quickfire questions for you, sure. What would you say are if you were to give like three, if you say the top three things for living a good life, what might they be? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
That's a good one. Well, I think happiness doesn't come from material possessions. It's the one that kind of a consumerist culture encourages us to believe, and I think that's something more people need to realize. Happiness comes from making meaningful connections with human beings. Happiness comes from, I think, from creating rather than consuming, from like putting your idea and your vision out into the world. And I think also happiness comes from making meaningful connections with other people. I don't think anyone is an island, and I think it's in community that we live our best lives.
Brilliant. But this is something I was going to ask you earlier, actually. Do you think, like when we were talking about the decline in religion, I don't know if you wrote this in your piece, but do you think a decline in religion also means a growth in materialism? And
I certainly hope not. I mean, that is certainly one possible direction this could go, that like people who no longer believe in God try to fill the void, like absorb messages from a capitalist culture about, well, happiness actually comes from consumption and wealth. And maybe we can try to steer the discussion away from that toward better avenues.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. Okay, so quick fire questions, Adam.
Sure.
You can't think too much about these.
Okay.
What's your favorite fiction book?
Oof, that's a tough one. Well, I really love Terry Pratchett. I think, I know he's probably more famous on your side of the pond than mine, but he had such a optimistic and like humanist view of the world that I really appreciate. His books are some of the few that I can reread over and over and still enjoy.
Interesting. Yeah, he is pretty big over here. I've never read him, but not like. There's there's someone who's trying to get a law changed to a Terry Pratchett's law. It's not called that. It's from one of his characters, but it's to do with like social inequality and the rise of prices and how poor people get priced out of things. And he's got an analogy. Yes, yeah, the Boots theory, which is. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, the Boots theory. There's a famous quote from one of the characters in one of his Discworld books that he says, if you can afford a pair of $100 leather boots, they'll keep your feet dry for 10 years. But if all you can afford is the cheap cardboard boots, they're like $20, and they'll keep your feet dry for a year and then fall apart. So in that same 10-year period, the person who can afford the better boots will be snug and comfortable the whole time. The poor person will have spent more money on boots and will still have wet feet.
Yeah, exactly that. And so that principle is taken, like someone's like bringing that into like talk about inflation and about how poor people are affected more by inflation and et cetera, et cetera. And it's really interesting how Terry Pratchett, who died recently, but he might be sort of have a legacy in that. So it's great. What's your favorite nonfiction book?
Ooh, that's a tough one. There's so many. There's this book I really like called Periodic Tales. It's kind of a story about the discovery of the periodic table and how human beings have always like used the elements as metaphor, and like the metaphors we find in our society that relate to the elements. I like that one a lot.
So like a mixing the narrative and the poetical.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, nice. What's your favorite film?
Ooh, see, I'm not a big consumer of media, so this is a tricky one. I'm gonna have to pass on that one. I have to think about it.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Well, favorite place you've been?
Favorite place I've been. Actually, I just wrote about this on OnlySky. It was the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico, which sadly collapsed last year. But until recent, until the collapse was open to the public, I still think it's one of the greatest experiences of my life was standing on the viewing platform over that giant dish and thinking about what it signifies about the best qualities of humanity, the way we can come together to build something greater than ourselves just for the cause of scientific understanding.
Oh, that's a beauty. Yeah, I love that. I love the symbolism of that. That would have been, yeah, I've just got, do you know what? Look, I've got goosebumps. Oh, that's nice.
Thank you.
So Last Supper, you're just about to die. You get one last meal. Sorry about that. You get one last meal. What's it going to be?
These are hard ones. I really like fried shrimp, but I rarely eat them because they're terrible for the environment. But I guess if I'm going to die anyway, I'll go out one last time in style.
If I go out anyway, I'm going to take some shrimp with me.
Yeah.
God damn you, shrimps.
And a good craft beer.
Yeah. Oh, very nice. Excellent. So you are just before you. It turns out you're not going to die now, but yeah, but there's going to be an apocalypse, and you're going to have your face eaten off by zombies. So you go and hide in a bunker, and you have a choice. You can't take any friends or family. Who would you take? You've got 3 people you can take for a month into a bunker with you. Who would you take?
3 like famous people, or 3 people
Whoever.
I know?
3 famous.
Oh, but I can't take friends and family, huh?
No.
Oh, this is another tough one. I guess if you're going to be in a bunker for a while, it should be with people who are really good conversationalists.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like Robert Ingersoll, a 19th century American freethinker evangelist, someone I really admire. If I can pick anyone from history, definitely him.
That's a good choice. That's a good choice.
Mark Twain, maybe, like someone who could really entertain you during those long nights.
So we got Robert Ingersoll, Mark Twain. I like it. 2 great choices.
I have to pick. I can't just pick all white men. So I really need to. I need to make a better choice for my third one. These are such hard questions.
I know. Well, you can't think about it. You've got. Do you know what? I love the 2 that you've suggested already, because they're great choices. I can see that would be an entertaining. I mean, Robert Ingersoll. I know someone who creates a Robert Ingersoll web page called the Ingersoll Times, and it's just he's always sending me stuff on Robert Ingersoll, and like some of the stuff that guy was saying at the time he was saying it was just phenomenal. What a mind, and what a.
I thought of a good one. I think Frederick Douglass, who I also admire quite a bit. I think, someone who comes at history from a very different perspective, but really had like an experience of injustice, but a strong sense of justice, I think would be someone's perspective I would like to hear.
That's brilliant. Yeah, 3 great choices. Love it. Well, look, Kirk Marshall, I'm going to subscribe to you now on OnlySky, so that's fantastic. Thanks for that, Kirk. And thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to say? Any way you'd like to plug yourself?
Yeah, certainly you can follow me on OnlySky. I also have a Patreon, patreon.com/AdamLeeBooks, where I've been publishing some works of fiction with a philosophical bent. Perhaps you might like to check it out sometime.
Oh man, see, I love that. I wrote talking about zombie fiction, and I plugged these yesterday. But I've written I'm 2 books through a series of my own.
Oh, I got to read those.
Which is an excuse to shoehorn in philosophy into fiction. Like that was like the vehicle I wanted. Apocalypse is the best way because society breaks down, which is like what's important. How do you make those choices? All those kind of things. So yeah, absolutely love that. So yeah, that's really great that you're doing that. You'll have to. I'll have to check that out actually. Well, thank you so much, Adam. I hope this has been interesting for the audience. It's been interesting for me. I've loved getting to know you a little bit more. We'll have to do this again at some point in the future.
Definitely, it would be my pleasure.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you so much to all the support yet again from all the wonderful supporters out there, all the people that have been doing the great chats, all the people who are super chatting. Obviously, that's super important. It allows me to continue to do what I do. There's also Buy Me a Coffee in the links below and PayPal and all that, but only if you have the disposable income to do so. But thank you so much for all your support. I hope you're getting stuff out of these interviews, and this was another really great interview, and I love talking to Adam, and I hope to speak to him again. Thank you, Adam.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Cheers.